It was the perfect house in the perfect neighborhood. The family had been searching for months for their dream home, and when they stumbled upon this one, they knew it was meant to be. It was a charming two-story house with a big backyard and a porch swing. The neighbors were friendly, and the school was just down the street. But something wasn't quite right. The family started receiving letters in the mail from an anonymous sender claiming to be their neighbor. The letters were harmless at first, just mentioning small things like what the family had for dinner or what they were watching on TV. But as time passed, the letters became increasingly unsettling. The anonymous neighbor claimed to be watching their every move and described their daily routines in detail. The family was unnerved by the letters, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. At first, they tried to ignore the letters and hoped that they would stop. But the letters kept coming, and they became more and more threatening. The neighbor claimed to know their deepest secrets and threatened to expose them if they didn't comply with their demands. The family was terrified, and they didn't know who to turn to. They started installing security cameras and took extra precautions to protect themselves and their home, but the letters kept coming and the threats became more specific. As the family delved deeper into the mystery of their stalker, they began to uncover dark secrets about their own past. Secrets they thought they had buried long ago. The family realized that they might have unknowingly brought this terror upon themselves, and they knew they needed to find out who was behind the letters before it was too late. The father of the family, David, decided to take matters into his own hands. He began to investigate the neighbors, trying to identify the possible culprit. He noticed that one of his neighbors, Mr. Johnson, seemed to keep to himself and rarely interacted with others in the community. David's intuition told him that something was off about Mr. Johnson, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one behind the letters. David decided to follow Mr. Johnson one day and see if he could gather any evidence. He followed him to a secluded area of the park, where Mr. Johnson appeared to be digging a hole. David took out his camera and began taking pictures, trying to document any evidence that he could find. Suddenly, he heard a twig snap behind him. He quickly turned around and saw Mr. Johnson staring back at him with a menacing grin on his face. David's heart raced as he realized that he had been caught. "What are you doing here, David?" Mr. Johnson asked, his voice laced with malice. David tried to play it cool, telling Mr. Johnson that he was just taking a walk in the park. But Mr. Johnson didn't believe him. He lunged at David, grabbing him by the throat and pinning him against a tree. "You should have left well enough alone," Mr. Johnson growled. "Now you're going to pay." David struggled to break free, but Mr. Johnson was too strong. He began to lose consciousness as Mr. Johnson tightened his grip. Just when he thought it was all over, he heard a loud crack and felt Mr. Johnson's grip loosen. He opened his eyes to see his wife, Sarah, standing over Mr. Johnson with a large rock in her hand. She had come looking for him when he didn't return home, and she had witnessed the attack. Together, they called the police and reported Mr. Johnson for stalking and assault. The police arrived and arrested Mr. Johnson, who was later charged with multiple counts of stalking and attempted murder. The family felt relieved that their nightmare was over, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. They started to uncover more and more secrets about their own past, including a dark family history of mental illness and violence. As they tried to come to terms with their past and move on with their lives, they couldn't help but wonder if their own demons had brought this terror upon them. The memory of the anonymous letters and the menacing threat of the watcher next door would haunt them for years to come. The family had been searching for a peaceful place to settle down for a long time. They had moved from city to city, trying to find a place that would offer them the tranquility and security they needed. When they stumbled upon the quiet rural town, they thought they had finally found what they had been looking for. The town was small, with only a few hundred residents. The houses were spaced out, with large yards and lots of greenery. The air was fresh, and the night sky was dark and clear, offering a perfect view of the stars. The family had always dreamed of living in a place like this, and they were excited to start their new life. When they arrived, they were greeted by the friendly townspeople who welcomed them with open arms. The family thought they had finally found the community they had been searching for, but their happiness was short-lived. The neighbors at the edge of town were reclusive and odd. They lived in a ramshackle house that looked like it was on the verge of collapsing. The house was surrounded by overgrown bushes and trees, and it was difficult to see what was happening inside. The family tried to make connections with the neighbors, but their attempts were met with hostility and suspicion. The neighbors seemed to be watching their every move, and the family felt like they were constantly being observed. One day, the family's young daughter disappeared. She had been playing in the yard when the family noticed she was no longer there. They searched the entire property, but she was nowhere to be found. They asked the neighbors if they had seen anything, but they denied knowing anything about it. The family became increasingly suspicious of their strange neighbors and started investigating on their own. They began to notice strange things happening around their property, like their belongings being moved around or their dog barking at nothing. The family knew they had to act quickly to protect themselves. They hired a private investigator to look into the neighbors' past and discovered a history of violence and abuse. The neighbors had been involved in multiple incidents of domestic violence and had even been charged with murder. The family realized that they were in grave danger and decided to leave the town. They packed their bags and drove away, leaving behind a house in a town they had hoped would be their new home. The family never forgot the terrifying experience they had in that quiet rural town, and they warned others to stay away from the strange neighbors at the edge of town. Years later, the family heard that the neighbors had been arrested for multiple counts of murder and had been sentenced to life in prison. The family couldn't help but wonder if they had been in danger all along and if they had escaped just in time. When Tom and Sarah first laid eyes on the sprawling suburban neighborhood, they knew they had found their dream home. The houses were picturesque, the lawns were pristine, and the neighbors seemed friendly. Tom and Sarah were a young, attractive couple with big plans for their future, and they couldn't wait to settle into their new home. From the moment they moved in, the neighbors fawned over them. They brought over baked goods and introduced themselves with genuine enthusiasm. Tom and Sarah felt like they had hit the jackpot, with the perfect home and perfect neighbors to match. But as time went on, Tom and Sarah began to notice that their perfect neighbors were a little too interested in their lives. They would ask prying questions about their work, their hobbies, and their plans for the future. They would show up unannounced and stay for hours, insisting on chatting over tea or wine. Tom and Sarah found it all a little odd, but they brushed it off as friendly small-town behavior. Then things started to get even stranger. One night, Tom woke up to the sound of footsteps outside their bedroom window. He crept over to the window and peeked through the curtains, but he didn't see anyone. The next morning, Sarah found a strange note tucked under their front door. It read, "We're so happy to have you as our neighbors. We hope you'll stay forever." Tom and Sarah were unnerved, but they didn't know what to do. They tried to tell themselves that it was all harmless, that their neighbors were just overly friendly. But the feeling of unease lingered like a dark cloud hovering over their perfect suburban life. As the weeks went by, Tom and Sarah started to feel like they were being watched. They would catch glimpses of their neighbors peeking out of their windows or lurking behind bushes. They started to avoid going out in public, afraid that they would run into their nosy neighbors. One day, Sarah received a phone call from an unknown number. When she answered, she heard heavy breathing on the other end of the line. She tried to speak, but the caller hung up. A chill ran down her spine. Tom and Sarah decided that they needed to do something about their creepy neighbors. They contacted the police, but the officers dismissed their concerns. They said that there was no evidence of any wrongdoing, and that the neighbors were just being friendly. Feeling frustrated and alone, Tom and Sarah decided to take matters into their own hands. They set up cameras around their home, hoping to catch their neighbors in the act. But what they found was even more disturbing than they could have ever imagined. The footage revealed that their neighbors had been spying on them, listening in on their conversations and watching their every move. They had even installed microphones and cameras inside Tom and Sarah's home, monitoring their every move. Tom and Sarah were horrified. They knew they had to leave the neighborhood, but they were afraid of what their neighbors might do if they tried to leave. They spent weeks planning their escape, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. Finally, the night arrived. Tom and Sarah packed their bags and snuck out of the house, careful not to make a sound. They drove away from the neighborhood as fast as they could, their hearts pounding with fear. As they looked back at the suburban street disappearing into the distance, they knew they had made the right decision. They would never forget the horror they experienced. Moving to a new house is supposed to be a fresh start. For the Baker family, it was an opportunity to leave their old life behind and begin anew. They had been searching for months for the perfect home, and when they found the two-story house with a white picket fence, they knew it was meant to be. The first few days in the new house were great. Everything was unpacked and organized, and the family was getting used to the new neighborhood. That is until they noticed the abandoned house next door. The house was in terrible condition. The paint was peeling off the walls, the windows were broken, and the roof was caving in. It looked like no one had lived there for years. The family shrugged it off, thinking that it was just an eyesore and that it would be demolished soon. But then strange things started happening. At night, they could hear strange noises coming from next door. It sounded like someone was walking around, but they knew the house was abandoned. They tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to shake off the feeling that they were being watched. One night, as the family was sitting in the living room watching TV, they heard a loud crash coming from next door. They decided to investigate, and as they approached the abandoned house, they saw that one of the windows was broken and the front door was open. Feeling uneasy, they cautiously entered the house, calling out to see if anyone was there. But the house was empty, or at least that's what they thought. As they were about to leave, they heard a faint whisper. It was almost inaudible, but it was enough to make them freeze in fear. They knew then that the abandoned house next door was not as empty as it seemed. Over the next few days, the family could not shake off the feeling that something was wrong. They felt like they were being watched constantly. Even when they were in the safety of their own home, they felt like they were being followed. The father, John, was determined to find out what was going on. He started to investigate the abandoned house next door, hoping to uncover any clues that would explain the strange occurrences. But the more he investigated, the more confused he became. The house was completely empty. There were no signs of anyone ever living there, but every time he entered the house, he felt like he was being watched. It was almost as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. One night, as the family was settling down to sleep, they heard a loud banging coming from next door. They all rushed to the window, and what they saw made their blood run cold. The windows of the abandoned house were glowing a bright red color. They knew then that they had to get out of the house. They quickly gathered their things and fled the house, not daring to look back. As they ran down the street, they could hear the sound of glass shattering and the front door slamming shut. It was then that they realized that they were not alone in their new neighborhood. Something was living in the abandoned house next door, and it was not happy about their presence. The family didn't know what to do. They couldn't stay in the house, and they couldn't leave the neighborhood. They were trapped, with no way out. The next few nights were the worst. They could hear strange noises coming from next door, and they knew that they were getting closer. They could hear footsteps getting louder and louder, and they knew that something was about to happen. Finally, one night, the family was woken up by a loud banging on their front door. They hesitated, not wanting to open the door, but the banging became louder and more persistent. John finally decided to answer the door, hoping that it was just a neighbor. But what he saw when he opened the door was something that he would never forget. Standing in front of him was a woman, but she was not like any woman he had ever seen before. Her skin was pale and translucent, and her eyes were a bright red color. She was wearing a tattered dress, and she was covered in dirt and grime. She didn't say a word. She just stared at John with her bright red eyes, and then she vanished into thin air. The family was left standing in the hallway, shaking with fear. They knew then that they had to leave the house. They couldn't stay there any longer. They quickly packed their things and left the house, never looking back. The abandoned house next door remained empty, and no one ever knew what happened to the family that had lived there. But every now and then, someone would hear strange noises coming from the house, and they knew that the woman with the bright red eyes was still there. Laura had just moved into a new apartment building in the heart of the city. She was excited about starting a new chapter in her life and had spent weeks meticulously planning every detail of her new home. However, from the very first night, she noticed that there was something strange about her upstairs neighbors. At first, it was just the occasional sound of footsteps or furniture being moved around. But as the days went by, the noises became more frequent and louder, often waking her up in the middle of the night. Laura tried to ignore them at first, thinking that her neighbors were just night owls who liked to stay up late. However, as time went on, the noises became more disturbing and harder to ignore. One night, when she was lying in bed trying to sleep, she heard what sounded like someone dragging a heavy object across the floor above her. It went on for hours, and she couldn't take it anymore. She decided to go upstairs and confront her neighbors. When she knocked on the door, there was no answer. She knocked again, but still no one came to the door. As she was about to walk away, she heard a strange sound coming from inside the apartment. It was a low growl, like that of a wild animal. Laura hesitated for a moment, but then decided to open the door. As she stepped inside, she was hit with a wave of nausea. The air was thick with a foul smell, like rotting flesh. She looked around the room and saw that it was in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, and there were strange markings on the walls that she couldn't decipher. And then she saw them, her neighbors, or at least what she thought were her neighbors. They were huddled together in a corner of the room, their backs turned to her. They were naked and covered in what looked like black fur. Laura could see their long, claw-like fingers and sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. She froze, unable to move or speak. It was then that one of them turned around and looked at her with glowing red eyes. Laura stood frozen in fear as the creature stared at her with its glowing red eyes. Its face was twisted in a snarl, revealing its sharp teeth. It took a step towards her, and Laura stumbled back in terror. She knew that she needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. As she turned to run, she tripped over something on the floor and fell hard onto the ground. The creature was getting closer, and she knew that she didn't have much time. She scrambled to her feet and ran towards the door, but one of the creatures grabbed her by the ankle and pulled her back. She kicked and screamed. But it was no use. The creatures were too strong. They dragged her back into the room, and Laura felt herself being lifted off the ground. She looked up and saw that she was being held by several of the creatures, all staring at her with their glowing red eyes. She struggled to break free, but it was no use. They were too strong. Just when Laura thought it was all over, there was a sudden noise from outside the apartment. The creatures let go of her, and she fell to the ground. She looked up and saw that the door was open, and there were several police officers standing in the doorway. The creatures let out a loud growl and began to back away towards the corner of the room. The police officers moved forward, their guns drawn, and the creatures retreated further into the darkness, and then they were gone. The police searched the apartment but found no trace of the creatures. There was no evidence that anything out of the ordinary had taken place. Laura was taken to the hospital, where she was treated for minor injuries and shock. After that night, Laura never heard from her upstairs neighbors again. The apartment above hers remained empty for several months, and she eventually moved out of the building. But she could never forget what she had seen that night. Laura tried to convince herself that what she had seen that night was just her imagination. Maybe it was a hallucination caused by lack of sleep or stress, but deep down, she knew that what she had seen was real. She began to research everything she could about strange creatures and supernatural events. She read books and watched documentaries, trying to find some answers, but nothing she found could explain what she had experienced. Laura became obsessed with the creatures and started to have nightmares about them every night. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching her, waiting for their chance to strike again. One night, several months after the incident, Laura woke up in a cold sweat. She had just had a dream about the creatures, and this time, it felt different. She felt like they were trying to communicate with her, to tell her something important. Laura got out of bed and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. She could see the lights of the other buildings, but her own apartment was dark and silent. And then she heard it, a faint scratching noise coming from the ceiling above her. Her heart began to race as she realized that the creatures were back. She knew that she needed to leave the apartment immediately. She grabbed her keys and ran towards the door, but it wouldn't budge. She tried again and again, but it was like it was locked from the outside. And then she saw them, the creatures. They were standing in the doorway, their glowing red eyes fixed on her. They began to move towards her, and Laura knew that this time there was no escape. The creatures closed in on her, their long fingers reaching out to grab her. Laura closed her eyes and braced herself for the worst. But then suddenly, there was a loud banging on the door. "Police! Open up!" The creatures hesitated for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. Laura opened her eyes and saw that the door was now unlocked. She ran out of the apartment and into the waiting arms of the police officers. It was only later that Laura found out that the apartment had been vacant for months. No one had been living there since the night of the first incident. And yet, somehow, the creatures had returned. To this day, Laura still doesn't know what the creatures were or why they were after her. But one thing is for sure, she will never forget her neighbors upstairs and the terror they brought into her life.